When I'm not busy acting, I like to investigate issues of social significance. Recently, I was looking into the problem of structural defects in British social housing. A structural defect is the industry's word for a problem so serious and expensive that it triggers full legal liability. The entire system of fake records and bad faith processes is a machine designed to avoid ever having to admit to structural defects. But how do we know for a fact that landlords are deliberately faking records about mould and other structural defects? How can we prove this isn't just a series of unfortunate mistakes? The problem of structural defects is so big and frightening in the UK that the media outlets are not the best source of information. They're too afraid to tell the truth for fear of being accused of causing a panic or crashing the economy. But certain well-publicised cases have led to serious concerns about how mould and other hazards in the industry are being handled. There was so much suffering and so much pressure that some truth had to leak out from official sources. Ironically, it wasn't so much the major news channels that revealed the most, but rather the official, government-sanctioned and supported sources that turned out to be the most revealing. This is the Housing Ombudsman. He pretends to be a genuine alternative to a court, so that tenants bring complaints about serious hazards to him, where the evidence can be lost or buried. The Housing Ombudsman didn't want to make it too obvious that he colludes and conspires with the housing industry, so he had to tell some truth. He released this report, Spotlight on Damp and Mould. It's Not Lifestyle. In writing the report, the Housing Ombudsman was so confident that he could spin the story that he gave us all the pieces to reconstruct the criminal enterprise. The Ombudsman has the difficult job of protecting the industry from legal liability without completely denying reality. But the result in his damp and mould report was that he revealed practices that look very much like crimes, but without ever mentioning the law. For years, the industry's go-to excuse was to blame the tenant, your lifestyle, or perhaps for being alive at all, for the conditions of the property. So cooking, showering, perhaps even breathing. It was always the tenant's fault. In the report, the Ombudsman looked at hundreds of cases from 142 different landlords and was forced to conclude that this excuse, this blaming or scapegoating of tenants, was a lie. In the Ombudsman's own words, the practice of blaming tenants for mould reoccurred so often it's appropriate to call it systematic. Think about that word, systematic. That's not an accident, that's not a few bad apples. It's a protocol. That's the standard industry-wide play. But how do we know it was a deliberate lie, a fraudulent act, and not just a series of wrong diagnoses? Amongst many smoking guns in the report, a contractor confessed the script that landlords follow: ignore the real cause and blame the customer. Most landlords will tend to blame the issue on condensation created by the tenants, unless the damp has reached the water stain stage. The default position, the first move in the game, is to create a record that blames you. They'll only abandon this lie if the physical evidence of a structural failure, maybe a water stain from a leak, is so obvious that they can't deny it, or at least that was the position of the industry at the time of the HOS report. But what the Housing Ombudsman doesn't say in the report is that its own approach to dealing with cases encouraged and supported landlords in blaming customers. For example, a question to a customer like, "Did the wallpaper help with the mould?" would be a typical question which the Ombudsman would ask in order to complete his investigation and report in a way that supported the landlord's version of events and stitched the customer up so that the answer that the customer provided would be suitable for the industry. Even though the Ombudsman might be tougher on mould cases these days and take the risk more seriously, this does not mean that he does so for other signs of structural defects, for example like smoke drift. In those cases, the customer's evidence is treated with the same contempt as mould had been in the past. Perhaps most damning of all is that landlords were blaming customers for the mould in the full knowledge that it probably wasn't their fault. When landlords in the same Housing Ombudsman report were asked what the real cause of mould was, 28% said leaks and 23% said structural defects. Condensation was a distant fourth. Putting it all together, the Ombudsman report proves that landlords in British social housing are happy to blame tenants for things that are indications of structural defects that are the industry's own fault and the result of deliberate neglect. Perhaps I've created a confusing picture. You might be asking, is the Ombudsman honest and helpful or part of the problem? Without using the word Orwellian, the problem is how the industry and HOS use language. Simply put, the industry is threatening the government and public in the following way. If you don't give us what we want, or if you try to hold us to account under the law, the housing and people in the properties will suffer. Phrases like manage decline really mean that. We will continue creating records that protect us, for example, inspection records that show no works are needed, or that blame the tenants, and the country and the government will pay the price of us doing so. They are holding the country to ransom. The damp and mould report was really the Ombudsman covering his arse. It's not just that the industry was doing a certain practice, it's that the Ombudsman himself was overseeing them while they were doing it, and in case after case was ignoring the problem. He tries to anticipate any accusations from outside the industry by pointing out that early on in his tenure he was warned of a potential legal challenge if he tried to hold the industry to account. So don't feel bad if your landlord tries to threaten or blame you for something that it did. It's equally willing to blame and threaten the constitutional body that exists to hold it to account. Until we confront the decades of fraudulent records and safety breaches born from the terror of structural defects, nothing will change. Any money we give to the industry is just funding a lie. We need the truth of the fraud first, and only then can we begin to rebuild. Thanks for listening, stay safe, and see you at the movies.